So 7-3 is conducting World War I. So you can see the notion of total war. But before we get to that, what I want to say is that everything in terms of the conduct here comes down to really two things: technology and propaganda. Those are the two big takeaways, and the two things I want you to kind of absorb from 7-3 are that you had improved and new technologies, and you had the use of propaganda in a way that had not been done before to motivate the mass to participate, essentially. So total war just means a military conflict in which the entirety of the state is really engaged. So it's not, in previous wars, it was more of like a little endeavor that the military was involved in, but it really didn't have much to do with the rest of the state. And usually it was for specific kind of purposes that some monarch or other authoritarian leader was trying to achieve a specific objective and was using military force to that end. Total war is different. Total war is the notion that the entirety of the state is involved in conflict, and that the entirety of the state needs to essentially do whatever is necessary and sacrifice whatever is necessary to achieve their desired outcome. In the context of growing nationalism, this makes sense because at this point now, people aren't fighting for a monarch. They're not fighting for a king or for some individual's ambition. They're fighting for their nation. They're fighting for their people. And so the nature of what war is changes, right? Alongside of that, at the same time, you have this new technology which makes the war more effective. So the two of these things together are really kind of dangerous. But the first thing to understand is propaganda. So that's the use of art and media to really intensify nationalist sentiment. And again, they're using this nationalism, they're using this national sentiment to encourage people to, first of all, participate. So that's the obtain part. But also then to sustain support for war. Okay, remember, this is a long process, and you had things like women involved in war for the first time in terms of like producing supplies and taking over roles at home because you have a larger proportion of people, basically, or men, going to war because of the entire engagement of society that's going on. So in order to get people to do that, essentially, you had to motivate them in some way. And states turned to propaganda and nationalism as a way to get people to get in line and do the things they needed to do to engage and be a part of the war effort. Whatever, every country had their own vision of what that was and their own part of conflict that they were engaged in, but the overall message was, we need people to be involved in doing their part. On the technology side, we're just coming out of the Industrial Revolution, right? So you have the first use of industrial technology in conflict in a major way, and as you might imagine and probably have a sense of already, that dramatically increases the number of casualties and not just death, but also the maiming of people and the long-term disability of people in ways that just wasn't common before this because the weapons didn't necessarily allow it to happen on the same scale. You should know what trench warfare is, okay? So that's a type of warfare where essentially two sides dig trenches into the ground and form lines and fight each other from those lines. You can see a picture of one right there. Some of these trenches are still in Europe today. You could visit them from World War I, truly. But it was a really dangerous, protracted way of fighting because essentially these lines almost kind of get stuck in place. I mean, there was advances and, there was defeats across the lines, but it would take a very long time and you would have attrition on both sides that would just really wear both sides down. Beyond physically, beyond actual being injured, just mentally it would wear you down, of course, being in this environment for a protracted period of time. Some of the technology you should probably know, artillery, which was used in trench warfare, and this is the first kind of widespread use. This is really the first war that makes significant use of railways for the mobilization of people and stuff that was needed to fight. This is the first war that uses aircraft. Now, the use of aircraft evolved over the course of the war, so at the start they were really only using aircraft for reconnaissance, but by the end of the war they're dropping bombs from aircraft, and obviously as we get into World War II, dropping bombs from aircraft is, a commonplace by the time we get to World War II. First war to use tanks and submarines in significant ways. First to use grenades and flamethrowers and poison gas in significant ways. As I'm saying these terrible inventions, you should be thinking, wow, that's why a lot of people died, because these things were available now. We're not talking about people with slow loading muskets on horses. We're talking about people in tanks with poison gas. So more people die. So I just want to talk through the U.S. and kind of our involvement, or kind of get how our involvement progressed in World War I, because initially we were going to be neutral. That was really the popular sentiment in the United States, was not an appetite for engagement. But by 1917 we were in the war. We did enter the war. So we were providing some support, materials, and capital to the Allies before this point. There's a few events that kind of, I wouldn't say, it's not like A plus B plus C equals D, but these are formative events in the course of our transformation from neutral party that doesn't want to get involved to major world power making a very big difference on the global stage. So the first would be the sinking of the Lusitania. That's in 1915. Just under 1,200 people died, and about 200 of those were U.S. citizens. So that was just an angering kind of thing for Americans, that Germans attacked a ship and killed about 200 of our people. Somewhere on that same, you have something called the preparedness movement. And this was really a kind of conservative political movement that wanted to strengthen U.S. capacity for war. So the notion was, whether we like it or not, we're probably going to end up getting involved in some sort of global conflict, even if it's not this one. So we need to be ready for when that time comes. But remember what I said earlier, but once you start having a large military apparatus, it kind of becomes almost difficult to not use it because you have it. So that factors in here. In 1917, we had the Zimmermann telegram, so that was Germany inviting Mexico to basically join the war on their side and engage in conflict with us, with the United States. They were promised that they'd get their territories back, and that they would have German support, et cetera, et cetera. The British intercepted that telegram and gave it to the United States, and so we knew about it. But most likely Mexico was not going to support that with or without our knowledge of what was happening, because the understanding within Mexico at the time was that they probably didn't really have the capacity to fight against us, and it would probably not lead to good things for them. So they did not, as I said, they remained neutral, as we talked about earlier. But that, of course, think about it. 2 years earlier, the Germans had killed 200 of us. 1917, they're trying to get Mexico to kind of turn on us and fight against us. And then lastly, in 1917 is when you had the Russian Revolution and the Tsar being deposed, and the end of Tsarist imperial kind of rule in Russia. That was one of the reasons Wilson was pretty adamant about not joining the Allies, was because of the presence of basically an authoritarian model of government on the Allies' side. And so when that was gone, that was no longer something Wilson could really point to as a reason to not get engaged. So now Russia, remember, it was not immediately the USSR either. There was that 6 years. But now without a czar in charge, the U.S. could no longer point to that as a reason to not get involved. All right, this is the last slide, and then I'm going to have you guys start working on the activity. So this just kind of goes through the significant events that we talked about, June 28th, and kind of where all of this conflict starts from. By August, Austria is invading Russia. By September 29th, the Allies had actually stopped the advancement of Germany into France, and so that's there. 1915 is when Gallipoli starts. That's when the Allies start making their incursion into the Anatolian Peninsula, into what would become Turkey. And then later on, about a month later, is when the Germans sank the Lusitania. January 10th in the following year, then, so now into 1916, is when the Russians start trying to take over the Caucasus region, again, further incursions into Ottoman territory. It's also when the French win a significant victory at the Battle of Verdun. And then in 1917 is when the U.S. forces finally actually arrived. So remember, April 6th is when we actually joined the war, but we didn't have soldiers in the theater really until June 24th. And then by December 15th is when Russia's now in that period of revolution, and they declare an armistice. They're no longer fighting, and they've lost territory to the Germans. I meant to show that to you, so I'll go back to that map in a second. Once we get into 1918, the war is starting to kind of wind down. You have the 100 Days Offensive, where the Allies basically engaged in this kind of very big push to try to, finally end the war, and they were successful in doing so. And famously, November 11th, 11/11, is when the armistice was signed and fighting was over. They were still in a state of war. Remember, it was complicated. You had a whole bunch of countries declaring war on a whole bunch of countries, so it was a kind of a complicated web of war declarations. Well, it took about 6 years. It took about 6 years for all of that to end. And so through 1924, some of these states were still technically in a state of war, but they weren't fighting. Let me just go back to that map, because I did want to show you, and I just forgot as I was talking quickly. Hold on. Only because it is actually important, not important, but it's useful for you to understand kind of the context of Russia going to the USSR. So this shows you, before the war, this is where Russia ended. And then the Germans made it all the way to here. And then when they stopped fighting, when they had the armistice, they stopped fighting. And then remember, kind of not 1 year, but like 6 months later, when you have the treaty that actually ends the fighting for them, this is where that boundary then ends. So this is all territory that was lost, and actually Finland was lost too. So I don't quite, that line should go up here. But anyway, all of this was lost from Russia. And again, that factors